What's the creepiest thing that has happened to you that still haunts you to this day? Lived in the Hollywood Hills and this happened in the early 80s. Crazy knocking at my door at 9 p.m. I go to answer the door and there's a lady there just hysterical, talking about there's so much blood. She looks normal and is dressed in clean clothing, so we let her in. She tells a story about seeing someone get stabbed. I call the police, and 2 uniformed LAPD officers arrive in 10 minutes. They take the lady away, and tell us that she was reported missing, has a mental condition and lives up the street. All good. 30 minutes later, another knock at the door. 2 different cops this time, responding to the call. They have no idea who the other 2 cops were. Take our information and statements, description of the officers and the lady as well. Radio conversations back and forth ensue, and they really don't have any idea how any other cops could have picked her up, because they were given the call 40 minutes ago. I was at a mate's house spending the night when I was in middle school. As expected, we'd stay up to all hours, which didn't matter most of the time except the bathroom was right near his parents' room. About the only time we'd get in trouble was when someone would wake them up when nature called. To avoid this, we'd go out the basement door and just pee in the woods. The door stayed unlocked most of the time because we'd managed to lock ourselves out more than once. This was also compounded by the fact that we'd all wander out and find something to do in the woods on a regular basis. This night his older brother was home and kept barging in the basement door and raining chaos from above, so we decided to lock the door just to deter him. Not that it really would have kept him out, but at least he'd have to use the key, and that took barging and fun out of it. About midnight we heard the handle jiggling and didn't think much of it, figuring it was his brother. After about 5 minutes of off and on handle fondling, my vocabulary has decided to not function at a high level today, we finally hit the door and yelled for him to stop. Quiet. No response, no more clattering of the handle. Great, we can move on, right? Well, about 10 minutes later it started again, and the process repeated. This went on for about 2 hours, until finally after telling him to stop we just said screw it and ignored it. He continued for about 30 minutes after our last attempt for him to stop and then just gave up. Well, fast forward to about 9 a.m., we were just stirring and one of my mates had to go to the bathroom. If you've ever had a sleepover like that, there are bodies strewn wherever there is space, and once the first person starts walking around it kind of stirs the nest. We all started stretching and making our way to relieve ourselves of all the soda we'd binged on the night before. As I go walk outside I grabbed the door handle to close it behind me and noticed it felt rough. After looking at it I saw that the space around the keyhole was all but destroyed. There were giant scratch marks on every surface and the metal guides were bent and skewed. I asked my friend that lived there what had happened, and he said it was the first he'd noticed it. Not really wanting to get blamed for something his brother did, we went upstairs and told his parents about the night before. After his dad went down to see what we were talking about, he went completely white and ran upstairs to call the cops. Evidently someone had been trying to force the lock open while we were all inside. That's actually happened to me more than once on different occasions. What completely freaks me out about this time was that this person knew we were in there and that we knew someone was trying to get in. Even so, he repeatedly tried to force his way inside. God knows what sort of person that was. When I was 7 years old my mom gave birth to my little sister. Me and my dad went to visit her in the hospital to check out the new family member. As 7-year-olds often do, I got bored, so my parents sent me to the kiosk right outside the main building to get an ice cream. As I was walking towards the kiosk I cut over the lawn as it was a shorter walk. Suddenly I feel and hear a really heavy thud right behind me. I turn around to see the warped, mangled body of a man in a hospital gown maybe 40 to 50 centimeters from where I was standing. The man had jumped off the hospital roof after receiving news he had terminal cancer. My mom and a lot of the others in the birth ward even saw the guy flying past the windows. The guy basically just fell short of killing me with him. A group of doctors and psychiatrists asked me to get emergency therapy, but I insisted on getting my ice cream and go home. This day I can still recall the thud of the body hitting the ground and his body lying next to me, clear as crystal. I still tell this story sometimes, mostly when I'm drunk or high. I don't know why it comes up, but I think that shit stuck with me. My boyfriend works night shift, and I was asleep alone in the house. I get woken up in the middle of the night by my puppy whining in the living room, and I assume it's because he wants outside. I'm just about to open the back door, when I hear this weird scratching and clicking sound at the front door, like someone was sticking something in the lock. I go to check, and I can see the silhouette of somebody standing there through the window in the door. I then notice there is a second figure in the living room window, although it's too dark to make out any features. I know they can see me because I didn't have any blinds at this point, and they just stood there. I totally freaked and called the cops, then my dad. I huddled in the kitchen out of sight of any windows and waited for someone to come. My parents live across town and showed up before the cops. They were gone at this point, but the neighbors across the street were up and saw the car. I ended up staying at my parents' place that night, and when I came home the next morning, I noticed the basement window was partially kicked in. I got a security system installed the next day. I still have no idea who it was. Well, I'm late, but whatever. So about 2 years ago I was in my room reading a book when I hear it. Soft as ever, two little girls giggling. Not just any giggle. It was the kind of giggling you hear in horror movies. I immediately put down my book and listened. After about a minute of holding my breath, I decided it must have come from outside. Then that night, just as I'm about to drift off to sleep, I hear it again. Two little girls giggling. Now it was 2 a.m. and I was pretty damn sure there weren't two little girls outside my window at that time of night, so I began to freak out. I sat up in my bed and waited for what felt like forever just listening. Then I hear it again. I jumped out of my bed and go spend the rest of the night in the guest room. By the next morning I was convinced my room was haunted. For the next week I avoided my room and spent my nights in the guest room unbeknownst to my family. I was afraid to tell anyone for fear I was going crazy or they wouldn't believe me. But every time I spent more than an hour in my room I would hear those two little girls giggle. By the end of the week I was a mess. I could barely sleep and was terrified of my room. Then one morning my brother walks up to me and says, "You deaf or something?" Obviously I was confused, and after further questioning he tells me about this small device he had placed in my room. Apparently it's like some sort of prank device that's easily hidden and can make a variety of different noises. My brother, however, chose the creepy little girls giggling sound. He wondered why I hadn't heard it or said something about it all week, and I just wanted to punch him in the face. So my room wasn't haunted after all. Moral of the story: sometimes your brother is just an asshole. I delivered newspapers in a fairly rural area the summer after I graduated high school. One night, it's pouring rain and I'm driving down this dirt road that is a dead end to a farmer's house. I've been down this road a few dozen times and know the routine: drop the paper off in the box at the end of the drive, whip a shitty, back up the road and off to my next stop. This time, as I'm getting out of my car to place the newspaper in the holder, I see this man in the ditch wearing a drenched white shirt running at me as fast as he can. He got within 20 feet of me. I could see what my mind pictured as a hatchet or axe. I had never ran so hard in my life. Edit: I ran back around the front of my car, jumped in and took off. Everything happened so fast that I almost didn't realize where I was. It must have been about 5 to 10 miles later that I attempted to call 911. No signal using my Motorola flip phone in the middle of nowhere in the year 2000. I had to stop at a farmer's house to call the police at 2 a.m. Turns out the guy unalived himself within an hour of his run with me in that wooded ditch. When my aunt was in college, she took a night lab class that would let out late. One night she was walking back to her car and someone came up behind her, pressed something into her back, and told her to keep walking. Suddenly a man coming toward her who she had never met before looked at her, threw open his arms for a hug, and said, "How are you? I haven't seen you in so long." He then whispered, "Play along. He has a gun." My aunt immediately played along, hugging back and acting excited to see this stranger. The guy who was behind my aunt quickly backed off and walked away. The hero took my aunt to the nearest emergency alert post, pushed the button for her, and told her to stay put while he went to get help. He never returned. When I was 6, 28 years ago, my mom and dad took me and my younger sister to an MLB game, leaving my grandmother to babysit my youngest sister. When we got back, my grandmother told my folks that two guys had come by the house with photography equipment and asked whether a young girl with red curly hair lived there, and that they had spotted her and that she would be a great child model for some advertising work they were doing. When my grandmother said she wasn't home, they said they would come back another time. My grandmother and mom didn't think much about it, but my dad said something's not right here and called the police. 15 minutes later, several FBI agents showed up and began conducting interviews with my grandmother and my parents while I ran around and showed the agents my Matchbox police helicopter. Turns out we had been targeted by a child theft ring. The photographers would take a bunch of photos and wait until the toddler threw a tantrum, and the photographers would then ask the mother to go grab a toy to keep the child entertained. While the mother was out of the room, they would grab the child and bolt, leaving everything else behind. The FBI told my folks that my sister had already been sold and would have been out of the country within 24 hours if they got her. We were advised to change preschools and other aspects of our daily routine. It still gives me the chills to think about what could have happened to her. Needless to say, Mom became pretty overprotective. It was a few years before she even trusted us with a babysitter. A guy made a Craigslist posting saying he was a talent scout and ran an agency. He got the interest of a father, grandfather and his granddaughter. This guy's specialty was casting families, preferably children, under the guise that he was looking to produce a film and needed actors. Not too long ago, the grandfather and his granddaughter went to meet this guy up at the house. They actually drove by 2 hours early to check out the house before going to it. There was a for sale sign outside the house and it appeared vacant. The family drove by later at the agreed time of meeting in the morning, and were greeted at the door by a man in a suit. He tried to convince the little girl to come inside many times. The grandfather got a bad feeling and left. Turns out, in an unrelated sting, the police caught this guy for CP charges. He had 10 counts of CP, and his home was raided. The father and grandfather, around the same time, reported this incident to the police. When the police found this guy, he had a bag with him. In it was a knife, zip ties, sex toys, and he even had plastic sheeting. He was going to pretty much unalive the grandfather, then bleep and unalive the child. His plan was to get this all on film. The camera was set up and ready to go. Luckily, the father and grandfather had a gut feeling something was off and reported the incident. This guy happened to be a kid I pretty much grew up knowing for about 15 years. He was even my brother's roommate for a while. He was always very creepy and I couldn't never pinpoint why exactly. I felt my stomach drop reading this news. This guy has been inside my home, and even went to parties I had. I have had multiple conversations with him. Luckily, he won't be getting out of jail anytime soon. I had a dog once that was super loyal and loving and would always come running to me when I called, and would almost crash into me whenever I had treats for him. One day sitting in the living room, all of his hair stood up on his back and he was just staring over my shoulder, growling and showing his teeth. No matter what I would do to try to get him to come to me, he would never break his stare at that one spot and just kept growling. I eventually carried him out of the room because it was freaking me and my roommates out so bad. Growing up, there was an extra room upstairs in our house we used as an office. It had a closet with one of those tiny attic access doors on the side. We'd sometimes all be downstairs watching TV and we'd hear a creaking sound moving toward that room. The room was next to mine and sometimes I'd find the closet door open with the light on and the little door to the attic cracked open. There was a spot on the wall that our declawed cat would always attack. There was missing paint from the cat attacks. All of that was creepy, but the night the dog, who never came upstairs without my dad, started barking in the hallway by my room toward the office was the worst. She barked and growled for a bit, then she started backing off, into my room, while looking up as if staring at the face of a person coming toward her. She backed into my room, then squealed like she'd been stepped on and ran into the far corner from my door and put her nose and eyes into the corner and whimpered. I picked her up and went downstairs to sleep on the couch. That was 14 years ago and I'm still freaked out by it.